Special thanks to Metro Japan for sponsoring today's video. The truth behind the reality of Soul King Adnyeus' ultimate fate is still shrouded in mystery. Why was it that a being so unbelievably powerful saw fit to allow himself to be not only sealed for all of time to come, but even horribly mutilated in the process as well? To have his body pulled apart piece by piece while he watched forevermore over the stability of an ungrateful and unknowing world. After all, the being who would come to be known as the Soul King seems to have been a totally altruistic, selfless man, the closest thing to genuine godhood the Bleach narrative has ever known. As readers, we're privy only to bits and pieces of the Soul King's story, first from the manga, then from the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World, and finally from the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime, the latter of which I'm still hoping will finally shine an irrefutable light upon the truth behind the curtain. In the light novels, Ryo wielded the divine power of the Almighty to split the primordial world into three to create the cycle of rebirth and save the human masses from the hollows who preyed endlessly upon them, in an effort to prevent said hollows from becoming one gigantic Menos when all existed on the same plane. Meanwhile, in the anime, we learn that Adnyeus fought off an oppressive yet elusive darkness before then splitting the worlds. And yet, we can piece together enough of a story to begin to understand the truth about what he was thinking, even if certain aspects are still unclear or perhaps even contradictory. What did the Soul King truly come to want? Did he intend to be sealed? And is the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime going to present a different version of events to what we've mostly come to know? Let's take a closer look. Before we get started, consider checking out the link to the Patreon down in the description below to help take your support for the channel another step further. It is greatly appreciated and it really does help out a lot, so thank you to everyone who has already done that. And speaking of supporting the channel, first a word from today's sponsor. Yes, the final season of the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime is just around the corner, so why not celebrate the culmination of your favourite series with some brand new merch? Metro Japan has a ton of exciting, authentic, and affordable Bleach merch in stock, and by visiting the link down below and using my discount code, you can not only grab yourself something cool to support the series, but you'll also be helping out the channel in a big way at the same time. Metro Japan is an online store that sells products from major Japanese licenses such as Nintendo, Pokemon, Sonic, One Piece, and of course, Bleach. With a catalogue of more than 100,000 high-quality products straight from Japan, many of which are rare and exclusive only to Metro, you can be sure to find what you're looking for, and of course they ship worldwide too. I was taking a look through the website earlier and there is a ton of awesome Bleach merch available, including a bunch of new merch that ties in directly to the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime. Needless to say, there's some really cool stuff here. I particularly like the Stirring Souls acrylic stands depicting Kubo's poems from the individual volumes, as well as the towel collection featuring shots from the anime's 20th anniversary trailer. Of course, Metro Japan's collection of Bleach figures and statues is a sight to behold, ranging from this incredible Thousand Year Blood War arc version of Orihime to my favourite statue in the catalogue, this one of Byakuya wielding his Shikai. So if you're interested in picking something up, maybe some very rare items that are even listed as such on the website, then make sure to visit the site using my link in the description or the pinned comment down below, and use my discount code TOMO10, which runs for 1 week from today, to get $10 off of orders greater than $100. Let me know down in the comments what you decide to pick up. Thanks everyone, and thanks again to Metro Japan for supporting the channel by sponsoring today's video. So, what's going on in regards to the Soul King's sealing and his gruesome fate? Why would someone with that much power, the most power we've ever known in the series, allow himself to be savagely mutilated beyond repair, and to exist somewhere between life and death for the next million years? Did he truly allow it to happen, or did something or someone intervene to ensure it was so? Well, as I said, we can piece together at least some of the story, and maybe even some of his motivation too, from what we've seen in the manga, anime, and the light novels. Ironically, the manga touches upon the Soul King's history and subsequent motivation the least of all. In the manga, Yhwach muses that Adnyeus likely foresaw the day of his own death, before proceeding to stab him through the chest. Later, when Yhwach absorbs much of his father's power, the surplus power that Yhwach isn't strong enough to contain spills out of his body. In chapter 621, as the Soul King's power flows from Yhwach himself, it takes on the shape of an army of tiny monsters. Although Yhwach's Schutzstoffel, his elite guard, are initially scared of them as the creatures flood the palace, Hashwolf informs his fellow Quincy that this is the Soul King's power unleashed, now freed from the seal the Shinigami placed upon it. As the flood of tiny black monsters swarms the Schutzstoffel, Hashwolf reassures them by explaining that they will not be harmed, for the Soul King's enemies are none other than the Shinigami. This is a very interesting little exchange because as far as the manga goes, this is really the only time we get any kind of explicit insight into the Soul King's point of view, even if it is coming from a third party in Hashwolf. And while you might be thinking, well, why should we believe Hashwolf? How does he know what he's talking about? The proof is in the pudding. The Soul King's power leaves the Quincy untouched, and instead chooses to head down towards the Serete, where it attacks and almost engulfs the Gote 13 entirely. Like I said, as crazy as it sounds, this is all we really get regarding the Soul King's motivation here in the manga. And if you wanted to know why he hated the Shinigami, well, too bad. I guess that isn't completely fair. The writing is kind of on the wall. It doesn't necessarily need to be spelled out to us. Back in the day, we had no choice but to assume the Shinigami somehow, at some point, placed a seal on Reo. Presumably that meant they split apart his body and locked him within his crystal prison. And of course that was sufficient reason for the Soul King to hate the Shinigami. Yhwach also explains in chapter 615 that the Soul King was created specifically to stabilize the Soul Society, as so many souls pass through it. And again, this is really our only insight into why the Soul King exists as he does in the manga, beyond the general holding the three worlds together, that is. Before we continue with the video, if you haven't yet hit subscribe, please do consider doing so today. It does help out enormously, especially on our quest to reach 300,000 subs. If you enjoy Bleach content like this every single week, then it does help out massively. And thank you to everyone who has subscribed. I really do appreciate it. And then, after the manga concluded, the light novel series Can't Fear Your Own World was released, and it reopened the book on the Soul King and his mysterious past. You see, the villain of the novel, Tokinada Suneyashiro, believes the world to be a meaningless place built on the back of an unfathomable, irredeemable sin. And that sin is the creation of the Soul King, and as such he knows what happened on that fateful day, or at least he's been told as much. But still, for this plot point to work, the Soul King's history had to be revealed. In chapter 22 of this specific volume of Can't Fear Your Own World, it is revealed that over 1 million years prior to the Soul King's death in the 1000-year Blood War arc, the world of Bleach as we know it was but one plane. The primordial world, a turbulent wasteland where all of existence coalesced into one entropic space. As the Hollows there preyed upon the defenseless humans and began to evolve themselves into Menos, the being Adnyeus was born into the world, and annihilated the Menos to protect the people. However, 5 figures, who would later be revealed to be the ancestors of the 5 noble houses of the Soul Society, decided to create what they believed to be a better world, and sealed the Soul King inside a crystal prison, before harnessing the power of his Almighty to split the primordial world into the Soul Society, Waco Mundo, and the world of the living. Despite his ability to see into the far-flung future, as well as wield godly, nigh unstoppable power, Adnyeus, for whatever reason, refused to fight back, instead accepting his fate calmly and without resistance. And so, the ancestors of the noble houses imprisoned him. But even that wasn't enough for them. Despite his apparent peaceful stasis, they feared Adnyeus' true strength, should he decide to rebel and free himself, and so took the time to break his body into pieces, ripping off the Soul King's arms and gouging out his organs, leaving him little more than a desiccated shell, suspended forever in a liminal space between life and death, while they reaped the benefits of the new status quo they used his power to build. What's kind of strange about this sequence of events as presented in the light novels is that it seems to imply the Soul King's body was pulled apart after he was placed in the Crystal Prison, and I'm not entirely sure how that really works. But the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime has delved even deeper into the story of the Soul King, revealing more about his true intentions, while also deviating from the path set out in both the manga and the light novel to some degree. Although we don't yet know the full story from the anime, please, Core 4, that's what I want to see the most. Yhwach arc seems to believe it was a conscious decision of Adnyeus to split the primordial world, which the anime reveals to be the primordial sea, inhabited by both Adnyeus and his son, into the three worlds we know, at the same time creating the cycle of rebirth, a cycle that seemed to spitefully exclude the Quincy race. Although we don't know the truth yet of what happened, we see Adnyeus wielding a strange ceremonial sword that also kind of resembles a turnkey of sorts, and using that to begin the process of splitting the worlds, churning up the water around him. The three worlds seem to be designated by three arrows, implanted in the seabed at different points about the Soul King's person. Ichigo was only shown glimpses of what became of Ryo in this moment, but from what we can tell, Adnyeus' body seemed to crumble and break apart, almost like an eroding statue, while still clutching the ceremonial sword, before his body parts fell into the waters of the primordial sea as the cycle of rebirth was created and they were effectively flushed out. It seems likely then that much of him was washed to various different places. The right arm found itself in what became the Soul Society, while both the torso and the left arm were collected by Ichibei Hyosabe, who was clearly present at the time of Ryo's fall. Ichibei is an interesting component in all of this too. The story is not complete without him. The anime seems to be, I would say, drawing a pretty implicit connection between what became of the Soul King and Ichibei himself, while it has yet to introduce the concept of the five noble house ancestors at all. Earlier I mentioned that the appearance of the Soul King's power was perhaps the only explicit reference to a motive for Adnyeus in the manga. And of course Hashwolf mentions that the Shinigami placed a seal upon his power as well. Interestingly, that moment is scrubbed from the anime, replaced instead by a card text at the halfway point of episode 31 that actually presents a multitude of different reasons for why the Soul King's power attacked the Gotei 13. Rather than outright committing to the idea that the Shinigami were in fact Adnyeus' true enemies, the card instead notes that this torrent of power is either a manifestation of an unconscious resentment towards the Shinigami for sealing Ryo in the first place, the Soul King's true identity being that of a Quincy, and therefore him harbouring a grudge against the Shinigami, or that Yhwach's own will was mixed into the torrent of power, and that is what caused it to attack the Gotei. And so, there's now an interesting contradiction at the centre of the Soul King's being. Yhwach himself believes that his father specifically chose to exclude the Quincy race from his new world vision, while even the likes of Senjumaru believe that the Soul King forsook the Quincy people, so clearly this is an idea that has gained prominence. However, when the Soul King's power is at last released again after so long, it does still choose to target the Shinigami and their society, and seems to want for Yhwach ultimate success. In the anime, the Soul King's overflowing power is explicitly shown helping his son rebuild their Quincy nation in the sky above, overtaking the royal palace and transforming it into Varvelt. Now, of course, Yhwach has absorbed the Soul King by this point, though one would expect, I think it would be reasonable to expect, that the Soul King's surplus power is still acting of its own accord, though I guess you could just as easily say that once Yhwach has finished absorbing Reo, he now has full control over all of it. I would argue the manga definitely didn't present that, but as mentioned already, we are straying from the manga here. The royal palace, by the way, Yhwach himself refers to as a decrepit gravestone, a symbol of the injustice brought upon his father, and likely even himself, when they lived in the primordial sea, and now just a marker for the dead. Supporting the idea that the Soul King actually hates the Shinigami is the fact that Yhwach was surprised to learn Mimihagi wanted to help protect the Shinigami, leading him to believe Adnyeus' will no longer resided in the right arm at all. We do get that one shot of a young Yhwach crying in the primordial sea as well, which implies he can see something taking place before him, something that upset him greatly. Was it the fact that Adnyeus was choosing to upend their lives by creating the three worlds? That would be pretty interesting. Maybe the young Yhwach is crying as he pleads with his father to not do this. Or perhaps more likely, did he watch his father's dismemberment take place before his very eyes, before he was thrust out and into the newly created world of the living? Either way, despite Yhwach's apparent anger towards his father, he does also take pity on him, and wants to free him of the endless humiliation, as he says, placed upon him by the Shinigami, and in doing so, he also believes he is enacting his father's will. Interestingly, there also seems to be a contradiction at the heart of the Soul King's imprisonment too, one that crosses manga, light novel, and anime. Both the manga and the light novel make explicit reference to the Shinigami being the ones to seal the Soul King, but at least based on what little we've seen in the anime, it is the Soul King who makes the conscious decision to split the worlds himself, and based on Ichigo's vision in episode 16, that is what results in his body breaking apart. And, intriguingly, while the light novel notes that the founders sealed the king in his crystal prison before splitting his body apart, as we mentioned earlier, it is pretty clear, I would say in the anime at least, that the Soul King's body was retrieved by Ichibei, after which he was then presumably placed inside the crystal. But even this seems to contradict at least the plans the anime originally had for how all of this would work. A storyboard for the splitting world ritual from the anime, showcased at a Bleach anime exhibition, depicts Adnyeus' fall in almost its entirety, or at least what his fall was going to be. Reddit user MikoLeaf translated the storyboard, and it reads, "When the blade plunges in and stirs, the vortex splits toward the three arrows, and in that space where nothing remains, the arrows flicker. Immediately, the Soul King's arm falls, leaving behind three voids in an instant as the water surges. His limbs are swept away, and the Soul King is trapped within. This water-like substance, once solidified, becomes the crystal that imprisons the Soul King." Certainly, some of this has been retained in the anime. The Soul King's arms break away once he uses the sword, the three arrows are still involved, and crucially his limbs are all still swept away. However, at least as far as this anime storyboard is concerned, the water surrounding Adnyeus solidifies and crystallizes around him, forming the prison that we later see him in. However, this seems to go against the image showing Ichibei holding the torso of the Soul King, which we saw for the first time in episode 24, as presumably he would have been imprisoned prior to this moment if it all happened as part of the ritual, before the Soul King could really do anything. Also, this storyboard idea seems to counteract the notion that the Shinigami were the ones who placed the seals on Ryo and imprisoned him, at least on the surface. It could of course be revealed later, and we'll talk about this later as well, that this entire ritual was cooked up by the Shinigami, and that he was somehow lured into enacting it, but we don't yet know. So, with all this said and done, to revisit the crux of this video, what was going on in the Soul King's head when he allowed himself to be sealed? Did he want this? As you can see, it's not exactly clear-cut. Not until we know for sure the sequence of events that occurred that day, and more importantly, the driving forces behind them. I think it's also fair to say that whatever version the anime chooses to present is likely going to be the one that we as a community take as gospel, as it's the most recent version of events. It was overseen by Kubo, likely given his blessing, and like I said, strangely, it does seem to be the one that is contradicting the manga and the light novels. Anyway, did it all come down to Adnyeus simply being a selfless person who wanted to build a better world, and was happy to sacrifice himself in the process to achieve it? In both the manga and Can't Fear Your Own World, as I've said, those two do seem to be more connected. That not only seems unlikely, but seems to be explicitly erroneous. In fact, Can't Fear Your Own World makes it known that the idea to separate the primordial world in the first place came from the noble ancestors, not Ryo. As far as we're aware, in the manga and the light novel, Ryo was content with the primordial world once he had rid it of the Menos. There's no doubt about it. Can't Fear Your Own World, the version we see of the Soul King's history in here, seems to have been written more so with the manga's limited explanations in mind, which makes total sense. It's a continuation of that. In this version, the Soul King was essentially tricked and brutally betrayed by the earliest ancestors of the Shinigami. Although the Shiba ancestor tried to persuade Adnyeus to use his power to split the worlds, the Yashiro ancestor took that opportunity to seal Adnyeus within his crystal prison. Presumably from here, they somehow forced him to then use the godly power of the Almighty to create the Soul Society, Waco Mundo, and the world of the living. Interestingly, in Can't Fear Your Own World, Ichibei asserts that Ryo certainly had his own will, but intentionally did not resist his imprisonment, and even gives some reasons for why he thought that might be. Whether Adnyeus saw no future where his imprisonment was unavoidable, no matter how he struggled, or perhaps he saw a vision of hope in the new world to come. However, that seems to be an optimistic view of things, and it's even possible, totally possible in my opinion, that Ichibei is an unreliable narrator, that he is intentionally obfuscating what feels like the real truth. Like I said, the light novel seems to have been written off the back of what was revealed in the manga, which is that the Soul King's true enemy is the Shinigami, and that Yhwach considered Ryo's position to be a humiliation. Therefore, in my opinion, the likelihood is that the Soul King didn't react to his imprisonment because he foresaw 1,000,000 years into the future, that the Soul Society would not only fall to ruin at the hands of his son, but that his son would put an end to his pain, free him, and likely take his place as the conqueror of a new world. I think this is quite an interesting interpretation, this idea that the Soul King didn't actually want to create the three worlds at all, and maybe he hopes that through Yhwach they will be returned to one once again. Despite his divine power, perhaps he thought it pointless to resist, and instead was content in the knowledge that his son would one day rise up to avenge him and destroy the Shinigami. Of course, even the Soul King cannot see beyond his own death, and Yhwach himself even comments that Ryo has likely foreseen this very day, when he approaches him in the palace. The thing you have to take into account as well with the Soul King that's a little more existential is that he is operating on a totally different plane to what we, and really any character in Bleach, can truly comprehend. You have to remember that when he was being betrayed and sealed by the ancestors, it is totally possible that he wasn't even truly present in that moment. The Soul King wielded the ultimate form of the Almighty, and thus was possibly looking 1,000,000 years into the future, into every future, all at once. So, while he could see their fates, while he could contemplate numerous avenues for their fates, while he knew the fate of the universe itself to come, perhaps he couldn't reckon with his own fate at the time. Perhaps it just mattered so little to him that he just let it happen in the knowledge that their destruction was inevitable. I like this interpretation because I like the idea that the Soul King and Yhwach are on the same wavelength. That being said, there's no denying that the anime seems to be crafting a narrative that feels very different to this, though like I said, we don't yet know the whole truth. But in the anime's version, the Soul King and his son appear to be much more at odds with one another in terms of their vision for the world. Again, we don't know for sure, but Adnyeus seems to have willingly created the three worlds in this version of the story, and perhaps even willingly sacrificed himself to do so, forsaking his son and those his son would come to represent at the same time. At least based on what little we've seen, including the storyboard, the anime seems to be moving away from explicitly blaming the Shinigami for what happened to Adnyeus, even going so far as to muddy the waters around why the torrent of the Soul King's power attacked the Gotei 13, opening up the possibility that it's just down to Yhwach's own will and has nothing to do with Ryo at all. In this instance, it's a lot clearer as to why he didn't resist his sealing. He either knew it was going to happen as part of the process, or he wasn't able to do anything about it when it did. But based on this, it doesn't seem to have been a malicious thing enacted by a third party. His limbs and organs falling away from him is definitely very strange, without the intervention of said third party, and again I'm desperate to learn the truth. In this version, I think Ichibei is potentially even more suspicious than he is in the manga and light novel version of the story. If the anime chose not to go with the water around Adnyeus becoming his crystal, and it seems they didn't based on the images revealed in episode 24, then it stands to reason that Ichibei was directly involved with the imprisonment of the Soul King. And of course, it's important to remember that in every version of this tale, the world is essentially inherited by the Shinigami, whether by force or otherwise. Ichibei is extremely content too with the status quo, as essentially the balancer of the world itself, right down to trying to bargain with Yhwach over his potential war threats. Of course, there is another avenue, one that exonerates Ichibei from any potential wrongdoing. Maybe Ryo and Ichibei were kind of closer than we maybe know. Maybe Ryo told Ichibei of his plan and told him what to do in the aftermath. Perhaps he said to him, "Look, I know what happens in this ritual. You have to seal my body afterwards so that I can remain the linchpin." It would also be kind of interesting if that was the case, if Adnyeus warned Ichibei of the wrath that Yhwach might then wreak in the future, and we've said it before in the past that maybe the reason Yhwach was this baby covered in black was because Ichibei covered him in ink to remove his name and his power. What if that was on the recommendation of Adnyeus, knowing his son would be angry over what was about to happen? The anime version is definitely interesting, and it still presents some of the same information the manga does. For example, Yhwach is still surprised to learn that the right arm has chosen to side with the Shinigami. Honestly, the answer that makes the most sense to me, and the one that potentially combines the three mediums together, all comes down to one key item: the peculiar ceremonial sword that Ryo is wielding. Where did it come from? What does it actually do? If the sword itself was made by the noble ancestors and given to Ryo to use before it then sealed his fate, that might explain everything. Adnyeus actively wanted to split the worlds in this version, but the Shinigami ancestors tricked him into destroying himself at the same time using this sword. Of course, there's the fact that Adnyeus can see the future, and so still did nothing to prevent this outcome. But with this, I think all the elements are accounted for, and Adnyeus would still want revenge on the Shinigami a million years into the future, while also wanting the new status quo for the universe, including shutting out the Quincy race. That being said, I do also like the new theory that Ryo confided in Ichibei before everything went down, including conspiring against his son, the future warlord-to-be. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video, a deeper look at the Soul King's motivations, at Adnyeus' thought process as he was splitting the worlds, as he was potentially sacrificing himself or being betrayed. I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you think was going on here? Did Adnyeus have a million-year plan to exact revenge on the future generations of the Shinigami and what would become the Gotei 13? Or was he not on Yhwach's side at all? Perhaps he worked with Ichibei to prepare them for a future that was to come, for a battle that was to come. I'd love to get all of your thoughts down in the comments below, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Remember to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Over 50% of my viewers are still not subscribed, so please do consider doing so today. It does help out enormously. And speaking of helping out the channel, check out the Patreon as well. A huge thank you and a massive shout out goes out to everyone whose name is appearing on screen right now. You're all really helping to keep the lights on here at the channel, and it does mean absolutely everything. It's making a very big difference. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.